As you think about starting your podcast or improving the one that you have, one of the things that you have to think about is your brand. What's the brand of your podcast? We're doing a whole series on branding our podcast, and so far we've talked about your title and your cover art. Today I want to talk about your content itself.
This is the place for podcasters.
If I were to ask you, what's your brand? What would you say? How would you answer that question? I think it's a question that would have thrown me off a few years ago because branding to me was something that large companies did that wanted to market their products, that wanted me to buy something from them. But the more I think about what branding really is, the more I understand that branding is messaging. And there's a lot that goes into that message and that communication, but it's all about trust. I think branding is about building trust. And as far as a podcast is concerned, I think there's three things that really help build a brand that builds trust between an audience and a podcast host. Your sound, your segments, and the length of your episodes. So when I talk about your sound, what do I mean by that? Well, everything, your voice, the mic that you use, your intro music and your outro music, and all of your sound effects. All of that comes together to create an audio experience for your listener. So what kind of experience do you want to deliver for your listener? And what kind of brand do you want to present? You see, you could have the best content, the most revolutionary content that will change the world. But if you don't pay attention to the sound quality, there's going to be a much smaller percentage of people listening to that than otherwise would. So if you're a podcaster that does it all, you create your content, you record your content, you edit your content, you process your sound, and you publish your content, spend a little extra time working on that back end. Learn how to do some simple edits. Learn how to do the post-processing. Learn how to EQ your voice and mix your sound so that your music sounds good with your voice and the levels work just right. The more you work on your sound, the more you focus on that audio experience, the more it says about your brand and builds a brand that your listener can trust. Let's talk briefly about how you build your content. That's what I call segments. I understand not every podcast and every podcaster has clearly defined segments for their content, but I think it's important to think about how we structure our content. For my podcast, Good Podcasting, I do have 3 segments and I don't clearly space them out. But my first segment, I always ask my guests about their podcast, what it's about, how they got started, and why they started it. The second segment, we move into the equipment that they use and their workflow and how they put it all together. And then the third segment, we always end with what are some of the challenges that they've faced, some of the things that they've learned along the way, and what their next steps are. You see, it's one conversation that flows from beginning to end. But in my mind, going in, I know what those segments are and I know how to transition from one to the next. And my listener, most importantly, my listener knows what to expect in my interviews. Every interview is different, even if the questions are the same. But those segments build consistency. Consistency builds trust, and trust builds a loyal following of listeners. And finally, let's talk about the length of your podcast episodes. I get this question all the time. How long should my podcast episodes be? What's the ideal length of a podcast episode? And my answer is always, it depends. It depends on the content that you're creating. It depends on the questions that you're answering. It depends on the problem that you're trying to solve. It depends on the format of your podcast. And ultimately, it depends on your target audience and what they want to hear, right? The reason I included this one is not to define how long your podcast episodes should be. My reason for including this as it relates to building the brand of your podcast is, again, it's about consistency and trust. You see, when I listen to a podcast and the first one I listened to was only 15 minutes, I'm expecting the next time I listen to that podcast for it to only be 15 minutes. I know that's not totally fair, but it's how our minds work. When we hear something or we see something, we have an experience, we expect that experience to be the same or as similar as possible the next time. So whatever length you choose your podcast episodes to be, stick with it and see how that builds trust as you build your brand for your podcast. Now, while we're talking about episode length, I'd love to know how long is the average podcast that you listen to? Let me know that in the comments. In this next video, I'm going to be talking specifically to those of you who do video podcasting. I know it's a thing. I've accepted it. I've embraced it. Video podcasting is here and it's here to stay. And since that's the case, we have to pay attention to what our visuals communicate about our brand. We'll talk about that in the next video.